Hello again guys, welcome back to the channel. In today's video we are taking a look at the recently released Aeroplane Heaven P-51D Mustang. This aircraft came as a little bit of a surprise to me, as we'd only recently had the Grumman F3 F2 from Aeroplane Heaven, so I wasn't expecting to see another aircraft from them quite so soon. A very pleasant surprise though, as of course the P-51 is a beautiful aircraft. Although we do already have one in the sim, it's not done to a particularly high fidelity. So of course this aircraft could be a nice option for any P-51 fans out there, and the aim of today's video is to assess whether or not that's the case. This video will be a full review, so we'll first take a look at the frankly stunning external modelling on the aircraft. We'll then head internally and do the same. Our P-51 is currently on the ground at Orlampa Airport, or Fantasy of Flight. As usual, we'll carry out a full startup. We'll be taking the aircraft just on a run around the local area, putting the flight model through its paces. We'll then return back to the field, we'll shut the aircraft down, and as usual we'll finish up the review with my overall thoughts on the product. As always guys, I do hope you enjoyed the video and find it to be of use. If you do, please consider giving it a like and subscribing to the channel. If you have any comments or questions for me, you can leave those down in the comment section below. As I've already mentioned, I think the external modelling of the aircraft is absolutely stunning, so let's take a closer look at that as we continue with our tour of the P-51. So as I expect you'll agree, I think Aeroplane Heaven have done an absolutely excellent job with the external modelling of the aircraft. Somewhat to be expected, it's really their forte when it comes to creating add-ons. They have some very nice external visual models on many of their releases. The P-51 though I think is really a cut above. It's really the best piece of work that I've seen from them to date, and it's one of the best aircraft that I've seen in the sim to date. Proportionally everything looks good, the modelling is very nice, there's no rough edges, no spots that I could find that were lacking in attention to detail. And again, when it comes to external models, you can tell that Aeroplane Heaven really love the aircraft that they recreate, and I think they've done a very fine job with the Mustang. Texturing is excellent as well, a number of really nice liveries for the aircraft, I think it's about 12 all up. Some beautiful real world paint schemes, a couple of civilian paint schemes as well. All of the wear and tear, the weathering as well, I think has been added very appropriately in the texturing. The aircraft certainly looks well used, it does look a little bit beaten up, but I don't think it's been overly done. The texturing is all very crisp, very clear, very high resolution. For me, the aircraft really shines in terms of attention to detail. You can see up inside the wheel bay here. Everything modelled in incredibly high detail, and again the texturing excellent, those tyres look pretty photorealistic. You can see we have all of the cabling, all of the tubing. Once again, everything very accurately textured, photorealistic as well I would say. I really like the PBR effect on the aircraft. And if we do just come a little bit further up into the wheel bay, you can see once more just how much attention to detail has gone into the aircraft. You can see the fins there in the radiator, you can see the uplock for the landing gear. I know this is probably going to be a contentious claim, but I would say that the Aeroplane Heaven P-51 is actually one of the most exacting models I've seen in any sim to date. Further to that, as with their Spitfire, Aeroplane Heaven do give you the option to remove various panels from the aircraft. I really enjoyed this feature on their Spitfire. It's perhaps not a function that you'll find yourself using all that much in the sim, but it's really nice to be able to see behind the scenes of the aircraft, as it were, see some of the details that you won't see on most other models. And for me, it really makes the aircraft feel like a little bit of a showpiece. It's almost a piece of artwork really. It's a really beautiful rendition of the P-51. The Packard Merlin engine has been modelled in very nice detail, along with all of the various ancillary systems fitted in around it. And again, I really feel with the P-51 that Aeroplane Heaven have upped their game. The Spitfire was very nice, but the P-51 really on a whole nother level there with modelling and the texturing. You can also open up the panels on the wings to display the 50 cal machine guns and their associated ammunition. I don't know why, but I found this particular detail really stunning. I thought the ammunition reels there were done very nicely. You can see as well just how high resolution the textures are with the labelling there on the panel above the 50 cal machine guns. So for me at least, as far as the external modelling and texturing of the P-51 goes, it's more or less a 10 out of 10. There's very little I could find fault with, and I think it's a really impressive effort from Aeroplane Heaven. Another nice touch on the external model of the aircraft, we do have the option to fit either drop tanks or two 500-pound bombs. To do that we can just adjust the aircraft's weight via the fuel and load menu. So here you can see the aircraft fitted out with the two drop tanks. And here you can see us fitted out with the 500-pound bombs. None of the munitions on the aircraft are operable, including the 50 cal machine guns there, but nonetheless I think it's a nice touch to have. It certainly adds to the visual fidelity of the model. Just be advised that, as ever, if you do purchase the aircraft at a later date through the in-game marketplace, then of course there'll be no visible munitions available with the package. Coming down now then into the cockpit, and I would say that it's almost done to the same standards as the external model of the aircraft. Texturing and modelling once again done to a very high standard, although as I say, perhaps just a touch lower than the external modelling. Aeroplane Heaven, as usual, have gone above and beyond in terms of modelling some of the features that are somewhat behind the scenes. For example, here you can see the units behind the pilot's seat. The cockpit, again, very nicely weathered, very nicely textured. I think all of the colouring is done very well. It does have a very authentic feel to it overall, and most of the switches and systems seem to work, at least to some degree. Systems modelling is perhaps the weakness of the P-51 currently, but we'll obviously take more of a look at that throughout the flight. The main reason I say that the cockpit doesn't hold up quite as well as the external modelling, some of the gauges a little bit rough around the edges there, some of the scales on the gauges as well, not quite as high resolution as I would expect, and this does make some of the gauges a little bit tricky to read under certain conditions. Not to be misunderstood, I would still say that the cockpit is well above average, it's just, again, not quite to the same standard as the external modelling. We also get a few nice options with the aircraft that are very discreetly hidden away. If we click on the little panel down below the gun sight, that will give us access to 3 switches which control various options on the aircraft. The switch on the left will replace the oxygen blinker with a more modern radio unit. The switch in the middle will open up the various panels that we saw there on our Packard Merlin engine. And the switch on the right will replace the Aeroplane Heaven pilot model with one of the default Asobo pilot models. Further to that, we can click on the controls just down to the bottom right of the screen here, and we can actually replace the gun sight altogether with a GPS unit, giving the P-51 a fairly comprehensive avionics suite overall. Another nice little feature, you can use the switch down the back here on the right of the pilot's seat to actually adjust the difficulty settings associated with using the aircraft's tailwheel steering system. Essentially, you can switch between having an accurate tailwheel lock functionality or a more simplistic system. We've already seen that you can open up the wings, look at the 50 cal machine guns and their associated ammunition. To do that, we can just click on the wings themselves. And lastly, just a quick look at the cockpit night lighting. We have both a traditional light and we also have UV lights on the left bank and the right bank of gauges. So once again, I have to give the aircraft very high praise when it comes to all of the texturing and the modelling throughout. That does tend to be Aeroplane Heaven's forte though. Usually where the aircraft falls down is potentially with the flight model or the systems. So let's now get ourselves comfy in the P-51 and we'll check both of those out and see what we think. So welcome to the cockpit of the Aeroplane Heaven P-51D. Running through our pre-start checks, the fuel quantities. Interestingly, the gauges don't actually read without the battery master on, which is a little bit later on in the checklist. I'm not sure whether or not the gauges are electrically driven, but you can see that some of the other cockpit instruments there as well reading quite strangely without any electrical power. So we'll get the battery master on out of sequence. You can see now that the vertical speed indicator there reading a bit more correctly. Anyway, we should see a full fuel load in the left main. The needles take a little bit of time to come up. We'll check the fuselage tank first, that should be empty. And indeed it is. And on the left main tank there, showing a full fuel load. And the same on the right. Carrying on with the checklist, the flap handle is set up. Carburetor ram air is set to ram. Carburetor hot air is set to normal. Rudder trim, the checklist actually calls for 6 degrees out to the right, but we're going to leave that in neutral. I find it's generally not required in the sim, but we'll see how we go. Elevator trim, no drop tanks fitted on the aircraft, so we'll leave that in neutral. Landing gear handle is set down. Mixture control lever is set to idle cutoff. Prop lever is set fully forward. And the throttle will crack about 1 inch there in preparation for the start. Armament switches are all off. Altimeter, that's set, but that's another slightly strange one. We seem to have both a hundreds and 1,000 needle there on the altimeter. The smaller outer needle though, that seems to read, I think it's tens of feet. You'll see what I mean once we're airborne. But I haven't managed to find any other examples of P-51s with such a gauge. It may be that it's period accurate. Gyro instruments are uncaged. Flight controls will check. And the flight controls are full free and in the correct sense. Park brake is set. Supercharger, that's set to auto, caged up. Fuel shutoff is on. Fuel selector will come onto the left main tank for the start. Fuel booster can go on. Battery and generator, again slightly out of sequence, the battery on and the generator is on. Coolant control can go to fully open. And the radiator flap control as well can go to fully open. Landing gear light, we have a gear down indication. Oxygen we're not going to require for the flight today, but we do have a good pressure reading there on the oxygen gauge. And the lights Just get the position lights on. For the start itself, a little bit out of sequence again, but I find the best way to start the Aeroplane Heaven P-51 is to get the mixture straight up to the fully rich position. We'll get the mags on as well. It's a cold start, so we'll prime the engine for about 4 seconds. And just checking that prop air is clear before we start. As usual, we'll give them a shout. Clear prop! And we can engage the starter. So we do get some nice smoke effects and flame effects there, as well as our lovely Merlin engine roars into life. Not too sure about the startup sounds, they're okay, they're maybe a little bit rattly, I would say. Anyway, we do have good oil pressure, that's up through 50 psi. We'll let the engine idle around 1200 RPM until things have warmed up. Oil temperature, we're looking for above 40 degrees, just coming up on that now, so the engine warming up pretty quickly there. Suction gauge is checked, and the engine instruments are checked. As with the Aeroplane Heaven Spitfire, the engine seems to warm up pretty quickly, so I think heating and cooling is modelled fairly simplistically, but the numbers do seem to be in the right ballpark, which is good to see. Anyway, just to simulate letting the engine warm up, we'll sit here for a moment, we'll head outside so that you can hear the lovely sounds of that Merlin engine, and I'll come back to you again once we're ready to make our way out towards the runway. Okay, so we do now have a nice warm Merlin engine there. Running through our before taxi checks, they're pretty straightforward, just making sure that the canopy is open. And we're not going to set the radio, we don't require that for the flight today. We'll run through some of our before takeoff checks as well, just before we head out towards the runway. So flight controls. Once again they're full and free. Directional gyro. Showing a heading there of about 190 on the compass. We'll set that on the directional gyro. The readout is a little bit strange. You can see if we set the directional gyro there, it's rather intermittent in terms of how it reads, but it does work overall. Attitude indicator is set. Instruments are checked. Fuel selector will come onto the right main tank now, and the fuel boost pump can come on. It'll be a flaps up takeoff, so the flaps are selected up, and just visually checking, the flaps are up. So we are ready for the taxi, the park brake can come off. Aeroplane Heaven have actually correctly modelled the tailwheel steering in the aircraft, so if we come fully back on the stick that will lock the tailwheel. We'll have to come forward on the stick if we want to use the tailwheel steering. It does take a little bit of getting used to, but it's really nice to see they modelled that. So we'll just make our way out towards the runway. We'll actually enter the runway and we'll carry out our run up once we're lined up. Taking the taxi nice and slowly. And again coming forward on the stick just to engage the tailwheel steering. Feels pretty counterintuitive if it's something that you're not used to. Anyway, all clear on final. And clear upwind. Getting ourselves lined up on the runway. And again locking that tail wheel. Gently coming onto the brakes. So park brake can go on, again leaving the engine idling around 1000 RPM. For the run up, the trims are set. Engine instruments are checked. We'll come up to 2300 RPM. And the aircraft is holding on the brakes. According to the checklist, we should see field barometric pressure more or less on the manifold pressure gauge. We're showing about 23 inches there, so a little bit off. Anyway, we'll carry out a mag check. So on to the left. You'll notice there that the control for the mags doesn't quite line up with the symbology, so slightly scrappy there on the modelling. There's 2200 RPM on the left, back to both. And onto the right. And again about 2200. And back to both. We'll slam the throttle shut, we're just looking for no backfiring there. Nice smooth rundown. Expecting to come back to around 650, 700 RPM. And everything looking good. Coming back up to 2300. And just checking the carb heats. Again, we have a slight drop there with the carb heat selected. We'll leave the ram air in the ram position. And again, coming back to idle. Engine temperatures and pressures looking good. Mixture control. According to the checklist we set to run, but I believe a rich would be auto rich. So I'm going to leave it in the auto rich position for our flight today. Supercharger, once again that is set to auto. We'll just nudge the throttle up back to 1000 RPM there. And lastly, just setting the coolant control and the radiator flap control to auto. I said we'd mention these switches again. I believe if we put these guards up, the switches should go into the automatic position there, so that's a little bit of a strange modelling issue. So we'll just select these switches manually into the automatic position. The checklist calls for the canopy closed for the takeoff, but we're going to leave it open. Of course we want to hear those wonderful engine sounds as we depart. Anyway, that's our before takeoff checks complete. We're pretty much ready to go. Okay, so looking at that windsock, the wind's pretty dead. We shouldn't have too much of a crosswind. The checklist calls for full power during the takeoff, but we're not going to need that. We've got plenty of runway, so we'll go for around 50 inches. That should help keep the Mustang a little bit more controllable during the takeoff run as well. The aircraft can be a little bit of a handful, but that's probably true to life. Of course, we've got that big beefy Merlin engine sat up the front. I find you do have to be pretty proactive on your rudder inputs to keep the aircraft straight during the takeoff run, but if we keep the tail wheel down, actually that helps a lot with controllability, so we'll aim to do that. Feet off the brakes, so we'll come back on the stick to keep that tail down. Feeding in the throttle. Just jabbing the brakes initially to keep the aircraft straight. Just until we've got some airflow going over the rudder. There's 50 inches on the manifold pressure, temperatures and pressures looking good. And just flying the aircraft off the runway. You can see overall the Mustang pretty controllable there with the tail wheel kept down. And we do have positive climb, we'll tap the brakes, the gear can come up. And we'll just climb up through 500 feet before we come back to climb power. Flaps are selected up and visually checked up. Coming up through 500 feet, so we'll come back to 46 inches on the manifold pressure. And 2700 RPM for the climb. And we'll get the aircraft trimmed out. And close up the canopy. So we'll start our turn out towards the north, headed out towards Lake Harris. We'll come round to the left. And we'll keep the aircraft in the climb for now. We'll get ourselves up at least above the first cloud layer here. Overall, so far the aircraft feels good in terms of relatively low speed flight. The controls feel reasonable in terms of input. Just leaving the airfield behind us. And we'll just work our way around this bank of cloud here on our left. As I say, we'll get ourselves onto a northerly heading out towards Lake Harris. Engine temperatures and pressures looking reasonable there. And now just coming onto our northerly heading, so we'll roll wings level. The aircraft seems to be very stable overall. We've got her trimmed out nicely here and she's pretty much sitting exactly where we've put her. Doing about 240 miles an hour here at the moment in the climb. Still got climb power set. We've got a climb rate here of around 5,000 feet per minute. I'm sure some of you will know how representative or not that might be of the real world aircraft. You can hear that wind noise is fairly loud. Overall I don't mind wind noise in an aircraft, I certainly like it when it's done well, it adds to the immersion. I would say though here it sounds a little bit too much like a howling gale as opposed to a rumble, which is generally more realistic in terms of what you'd hear. That may well be a Microsoft Flight Simulator issue though, it tends to be that you often hear slightly off wind noises both internally and externally. So as we continue to climb here, that climb rate is slowly reducing. Still keeping 46 inches manifold pressure here at the moment. My understanding is if we leave the supercharger in the auto position it should kick in through 20,000 feet, but we're not going to get up that high today. Come on to a heading of around 010, that should put us quite nicely on course for Lake Harris. A little bit tricky to see much visually with the cloud cover here, but we've got Orlando off at our 2 o'clock, we might see that a little bit better later on. And we should have the US 27 highway down somewhere off the right wing. Anyway, coming up through another cloud layer. The pitot heat is on. And actually we don't really need to go any higher here, we've got plenty of altitude, so we'll just roll over on our back momentarily, lose a little bit of altitude here just to put us below the secondary cloud layer. Again, the aircraft feels nice and roll. We'll go for a full deflection roll later on just to see what the roll rate's like. Prop effects there looking a little bit iffy being backlit in the sunlight, but again that seems to be a sim issue overall. And I noticed during that roll we heard the default sim sounds, which is a little bit disappointing that we're still seeing those sounds in a lot of payware aircraft. I'm not levelling the blame there purely at Aeroplane Heaven, almost every developer seems to do it. Maybe there's no option but to include them, but they're really not appropriate for a whole host of aircraft, so it's a little bit annoying to see those. Sometimes they break the immersion somewhat. Anyway, more or less in the cruise now. We'll come back to 40 inches on the manifold pressure. We'll come back to about 2,500 RPM. We'll keep a nice quick cruise speed up towards Lake Harris. In terms of our temperatures and pressures, we'll just look at those to see how representative they are of the real world figures. So oil temperature 50 degrees, probably a little bit on the cold side. Oil pressure, fuel pressure looking good. Coolant temperature just above 100, that seems reasonable, and the carb air temp just above 0. Fuel boost pump can come off. And just checking our fuel quantity. Burned through quite a bit there on the right tank, so we'll come back onto the main left tank. Anyway, as we head out towards the lake, we'll try a full deflection aileron roll out to the right, so coming right on the aileron there. Roll rate seems pretty reasonable. Again, I'm not that familiar with the P-51, maybe just a touch slow if I was guessing. But overall, the aircraft feels nice and roll. Just those default shakes and rattles, again, breaking the immersion ever so slightly. The rumble is fine, it's just the rattling I think is a little bit off. In terms of rudder, we'll just put in some rudder input there. Rudder feels pretty sharp, maybe a little bit abrupt there in nature. We come to a pretty dead stop in either direction. And you can see the aircraft sits straight back in the middle very quickly, there's not much oscillating around the centre. But overall, so far, all stress, I do like how the aircraft flies. It feels like a warbird. And it's definitely Aeroplane Heaven's nicest flight model so far from what I've seen. Anyway, Lake Popka, apologies if I'm pronouncing that wrong, but that's just coming up off the nose, which means we've got Orlando just off at our 4 o'clock. We've got Lake Harris just out at our 10 o'clock more or less. Of course, we don't need to be right overhead Lake Harris to carry out our manoeuvres, so just to save a little bit of time, carry them out more or less in our present position. We've got Lake Popka just off our right wing to keep our bearings. So we'll go for a loop, we'll build up some airspeeds. Can't see a red line there on the airspeed indicator, but we'll come back at around 500 miles an hour. Just come up to our climb power setting once again. A little bit of buffeting there as we get high speed, that's courtesy of FS Realistic. I suspect that's not representative of the default Mustang. I should have turned that off before the review, but I unfortunately forgot, as I always seem to do. So the aircraft feels very nice and pitched as well. Got about half deflection back on the stick here at the moment. We'll come up through another loop here, we'll go into a bit of an Immelman. We'll level the wings out as we come over the top of the loop. And again we'll go full deflection. Roll rate seems a little bit higher there at low speed, as you'd expect. That's how I'm really liking how the aircraft flies so far. Come all the way back on the stick. Going for a high rate turn, we'll pull some G. See how the aircraft behaves there. Trying to bleed off the speed, and actually the wing dropping there in the turn, which is really nice. There's not too many aircraft in the sim that actually do that. You can see we've gone into the spin there as well. I'm actually really liking the flight model so far. And again, recovering, just releasing the controls there. We didn't need to come back off the power. And again, we'll come all the way back on the stick. Just really throwing the aircraft around now. Quite interested to see how the flight model behaves. You can hear the pilot struggling there under some G. Again, that's FS Realistic. And again, the aircraft buffeting there as we get low speeds. Almost wanting to drop the wing. Putting in some left aileron there as well, trying to induce some unusual behaviour. The aircraft just about managing to cope with that. Coming back on the stick again, we can induce a spin out to the right. So I've got full left aileron there at the moment. And again, just easing up on the back pressure to recover from the spin there. So as I say, I really like how the aircraft flies. I think Aeroplane Heaven have done a really nice job with the flight model. Again, I think by far the best I've seen from them in Microsoft Flight Simulator to date. Overall, the Mustang a real gem so far. I'm really enjoying the aircraft. So going for one last stall, the speed just coming up on 150 miles an hour. That's the stall warning bell, I believe. There's 100 miles an hour. Ailerons now pretty unresponsive, that's almost full deflection on the ailerons. All the way back on the stick, 350 miles an hour. Bit of buffeting. Aircraft not quite sure what it wants to do yet. And the left wing snapping, entering into a left spin. Keeping full back on the controls. Once again, the spin progressing very nicely there. So again, we'll recover, easing off the pressure on the stick, and the aircraft recovering very quickly. Fairly easy to recover from the spin. I imagine in reality we might have to come back off the engine there. Once again, overall a big fan of the flight model from the Aeroplane Heaven P-51. Anyway, we're already facing south, so we'll get the aircraft back onto a reasonable heading back towards Lakeland. We'll come back on the power once again. So there's 40 inches on the manifold pressure, we'll come back to 2500 RPM. Those temperatures don't really seem to have shifted much there during our manoeuvring. I would have expected perhaps we'd have seen a slight rise there in the oil temperature and the coolant temperature as we were fairly high power, fairly low speed. Overall though, some big plus points for me there with the Aeroplane Heaven P-51 flight model. We'll make our way home, of course. It wouldn't be an Into the Blue Simulations aircraft review without a little bit of a cinematic at some point, so we'll head outside the aircraft, we'll enjoy the views of the absolutely stunning Aeroplane Heaven P-51 model, and I'll come back to you again once we're approaching Lakeland and ready to make our landing back onto the field. So we're just coming back inbound towards Orlampa. You can see the lakes there off at our 1 o'clock. We'll come back off the power, we'll put the aircraft into a descent, and we'll take the carpet as we do so. We'll just weave our way through the clouds back in towards the airfield. Unfortunately, I'm going to make the airfield a little bit trickier to spot. I find Orlampa's a pretty tricky airfield to spot at the best of times. But we'll keep a good eye out. I think we can see the hangar buildings actually just off at our 1 o'clock. So we'll carry out the downwind checks. Brakes are checked and off, undercarriage will hold, mixture is rich, fuel pump can come on, fuel quantities will check, so we've got about 30 US gallons there on the left and about 45 on the right. We'll come back onto the right tank for the landing. Again, just keeping sight of the airfield. Instruments are checked, landing lights not required, harness is secure. So we'll just fly ourselves overhead the airfield. We're actually coming up on the final position for the departure runway at the moment, but we'll come back round, as I said, fly overhead the field, we'll join in for a left-hand downwind back onto the runway we departed from. Again, really enjoying the flight model of the Aeroplane Heaven P-51. It really does feel like a warbird to fly. So just coming overhead the apron, reversing the turn, you can see the runway just down below off the left wing. And we'll just bring the aircraft around, join onto a bit of a midfield crosswind and then enter in for a left-hand downwind back onto the runway. Come further off the power, let the speed bleed back. Just coming back through 280 miles an hour at the moment. The P-51 doesn't seem to slow down awfully quickly here. We're back at idle power, the speed bleeding off quite slowly. And just coming up on 250 miles an hour now, we'll open up the canopy. And just keeping a good eye on the field. We'll fly a nice long extended downwind here just to give us plenty of time to lose the speed. Start configuring. Speed almost back at 200 miles an hour. We'll start the turn on to final. That should help bring the speed back further. And we'll take the gear down. Start taking the flaps as well. We want to maintain 150 miles an hour initially, back to around 120 on final. So just coming up on the throttle. And again, keeping a good eye on the field. Just off at our 10 o'clock. A little bit tricky to make out the runway currently. And we've now got the runway in sight. We'll keep taking the flaps. One area where I feel the aircraft perhaps lacks ever so slightly, the pitch behaviour in the approach configuration feels a little bit off to me. Of course, again, that's conjecture, but according to the checklist I'm using, we want to maintain 120 miles an hour down final approach, and I find that the aircraft really wants to settle closer to around 100 miles an hour. It's quite hard to get a smooth landing out of the aircraft as well. Pretty good visibility over the nose, but we'll just weave our way down final approach just to keep the runway in sight. And running through our landing checks, pitch full fine, undercarriage is down, flaps are set. Landing clearance not required. The runway is clear. So again, just keeping the runway in sight. We'll actually side slip the aircraft slightly here just to keep that runway in view. I find you do need a lot of rudder actually to get the nose to move at slow speed, so we don't seem to have an awful lot of rudder authority in the P-51. Anyway, looking good here in terms of profile. We'll straighten the aircraft up and we'll chop the power, so holding her off. And there's touchdown. All the way back on the stick to keep that tail wheel straight. We'll start coming onto the brakes, getting the aircraft slowed up. And just getting the aircraft nice and slow before we turn around and backtrack the runway. And backtracking the runway, again taking the taxi nice and slow. So overall a fairly decent landing there out of the P-51. As I said, I find it quite hard to get a nice smooth landing out of the aircraft. Anyway, we'll keep the engine back, keep the speed down, running through our after landing checks. The radiator coolant flap can go to full open, same for the oil cooler. Flaps can come up. And we'll just hold the rest of the checks until we're back now on the apron, just keeping clear of the fence. And again onto the brakes. The P-51 really seems to like to pick up speed, even with the engine power pretty far back here towards idle. But again, big beefy Merlin V12 to be expected. Anyway, we'll vacate just off our 11 o'clock. It looks like a CRJ has actually taken up our parking spot, so we'll have to find somewhere else to park the aircraft. Gently onto the brakes again, just coming forward on the stick to unlock that tail wheel. And easing the aircraft through the turn. You can see the Connie there off at our 2 o'clock. And I think we'll park just up here on the left, so we'll head towards the hay bales initially. And again, coming forward on the stick, we'll swing the aircraft around. Get ourselves faced out towards the Connie. So off the engine power, once again gently on the brakes, park brake can come on. Finishing up the last of our after landing checks, we'll reset the trim back to neutral. And the prop control is set fully forward. Fuel booster can come off. For the shutdown checks, we'll idle at 1500 RPM. And the mixture control can go to idle cutoff. Just coming through 700 RPM, we'll open up the throttle fully. And we do have a good rundown. The rundown time there on the engine, pretty reasonable. Overall, quite nice sound effects there. So the mags can come off. We'll close the throttle. We'll get all of our electrical switches off, so the lights can come off, pitot heat can come off, generator can come off. Looks like the rest of our switches are off. We'll get the master battery off. We'll get the fuel selector back to the fuselage tank, which of course should be empty. And finally we'll set the fuel shut-off to the off position. And that's the shutdown checklist complete. So there you go guys, I hope you enjoyed our outing in the Aeroplane Heaven P-51D as much as I did. I really liked the aircraft overall, and in some areas it was a very pleasant surprise. As usual, we'll just briefly break down the product into its negatives and its positives. We'll start with the negatives and work our way through to the positives. For me, really the only aspect of the P-51 that wasn't quite up to the standards that I would hope to see would be with the system's fidelity and modelling. The aircraft isn't bad by any means, it's pretty much up to the standards that I was expecting. But there are a couple of systems peculiarities with the product, a few things that we saw throughout that could use some work. For example, the gauges there before we had the battery on. I'm not too sure whether or not the fuel gauges should have been reading, but for sure the vertical speed indicator should be reading 0, whether or not we've got the aircraft electrically powered. This was the same as well on the Aeroplane Heaven Spitfire, so I presume it's something to do with the way that they model the aircraft systems in general. The same goes really with the heating and cooling modelling of the engine. Again, by no means bad, it all pretty much sat within the sort of parameters that you would expect. But it's obviously modelled quite simply. We saw the numbers pretty much sat around at the same sorts of values regardless of what we did with the aircraft. So again, if it were up to me, that's the area of the aircraft that I would like to see worked on a little bit more. It may well be the case that that doesn't happen, and it certainly wouldn't be a deal breaker with the product. The system's depth is still more than good enough. Again, it's just not quite up to the same standards as the rest of the aircraft. Speaking of things not being quite up to the same standards, again I thought the gauges were a little bit rougher in terms of modelling than the rest of the cockpit. We saw the altimeter as well. That could be period accurate, but it was a little bit strange to my eye. And perhaps more of a systems issue once again. It could be a misunderstanding on my part, but the radiator coolant flap and the oil coolant flap switches, they didn't return to the automatic position when we caged them up. Usually when you cage a switch it goes back to its default position. Likewise with the magneto switch there, the modelling positioning just seemed to be a little bit off. Anyway, I'm starting to be a little bit pickier now. Really my main point once again, the systems of the aircraft could use a little bit of work. Otherwise though, fairly minor niggles with the aircraft really. I felt that the default seating positions were a little bit zoomed out. They had a bit of a fisheye lens effect to them. So rather than sitting at the usual 50%, I zoomed into about 65% there, I seem to recall. It's not a big deal, but it is a little bit frustrating if you have to do that at the start of each and every flight. All in all though, that just about wraps up things in terms of my negatives, and there are certainly a lot of positive things that we have to say about the aircraft as well. Just before we get into those though, we'll touch on the frame rate. That was pretty much excellent. That was on a par with the default Cessna 152. For such a beautiful, high detailed aircraft, that was quite a pleasant surprise. So overall the aircraft very friendly in terms of any FPS hit. And lastly, I'll touch on the sounds now. I was going to put them in the positives as I quite like the sounds personally, but sounds always seem to divide the audience. On the Aeroplane Heaven Spitfire for example, some of you love the sounds, some of you hate them, so I'm going to suggest that you've heard the aircraft here for yourselves, you can make up your own minds regarding the sounds. Moving on to the positives then, I think I made it very clear throughout the review, but as far as the texturing and the modelling of the aircraft goes, I think Aeroplane Heaven's rendition of the P-51 is absolutely excellent. Particularly externally, as I said, I think one of the best models we've seen for Microsoft Flight Simulator, and arguably one of the finest models that I've seen in any sim to date. The attention to detail and the modelling, really top notch, and the texturing more or less matches up in every area. The same is more or less true internally. Again, there are a few harsher details in the cockpit, but I still really like the cockpit. I think it feels very authentic, and it's a very immersive place to be overall. The flight model for me was really the big surprise. I think that Aeroplane Heaven have certainly gone above and beyond what they've achieved in Microsoft Flight Simulator to date. During the takeoff, the flight model still had that slightly squirrely behaviour on the rudder, but it is controllable, and as I said, keeping the tailwheel down certainly helps. In flight at low speed, the aircraft flew very pleasantly, very stable, but at the same time very manoeuvrable as well. At high speed, again, the aircraft really a joy to fly. Response on the controls felt very crisp, very clear. The aircraft didn't feel overly sensitive. And as I mentioned during the flight, again, this is purely conjecture on my part, but I thought that the aircraft really felt like a warbird. I was impressed as well with the low speed handling of the aircraft. The aircraft stalled rather nicely. Certainly we saw it enter into the spin pretty organically there. There weren't really any surprises with the flight model, and it felt very good throughout most of the flight. Again, on the approach it feels a little bit off, and I would say just during the flare there as well, the aircraft didn't feel quite right in pitch. It's quite hard to get a smooth landing out of the aircraft. It did feel that the aircraft wanted to drop out of the sky a little bit more as opposed to gently letting itself down onto the runway. And that's quite unusual for Microsoft Flight Simulator. Most aircraft in the sim, if anything, suffer from too much ground effect. Lastly, touching on the documentation, it's fairly simplistic, but there's everything you need there to get the aircraft started up and up in the air. I did find the startup guide to be fairly descriptive, but very much done in a step-by-step fashion, so it wasn't very easy to run the startup process with the checklist provided. As a result, I went away and found a checklist of my own. Anyway, in summary, once again, I very much enjoyed my time out in the Aeroplane Heaven P-51D. Some of the systems aside, the aircraft is every bit as good as most of the competition currently available in Microsoft Flight Simulator. I think I've said it already, but I feel that Aeroplane Heaven really stepped up their game with this aircraft. Visually it's stunning, I think it sounds very nice, it's a joy to fly as well. It's very much on a par with most of the other warbirds that we have in the sim, and I would say it's well worthy of consideration, particularly if you're a big fan of the Mustang. Anyway guys, once again I do hope you found the video useful. If you did, please consider giving it a like. If you want to see more content from the channel, then please consider subscribing as well. As ever, a very big thank you to all of my channel members and patrons for all of your support, very much appreciated. I hope that all of you are having a great day wherever you are, take really good care, and I will see you all again soon.